Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Paul Vallely, who many of you will know as a journalist and writer on politics, religion and society. He's the author of several books, probably the best known are his biographies of the Pope, and he's just published Philanthropy from Aristotle to Zuckerberg. He's also Senior Research Fellow at the Global Development Institute, University of Manchester, and visiting professor in public ethics at the University of Chester. And I could say more about his biog, but there isn't the time. So it's 750 pages long, this book. It is a really rewarding read, I have to say, and it was 6 years in the writing. And Paul, what you didn't know 6 years ago was the circumstances we'd find ourselves in as your book is published. Why is a pandemic perhaps an opportune time for us to consider, again, the nature of philanthropy?
Well, philanthropists are doing quite well in this pandemic. I mean, in two ways. Their fortunes have increased enormously. Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg, Warren Buffett and co are worth about $250 billion more now than they were at the start of the pandemic. But philanthropy's had a good pandemic in the sense that it's been more agile than a lot of governments. They've given and pledged about $14 billion in the fight against COVID-19, and if you look at Bill Gates, for example, he warned about this possibility of a pandemic after the Ebola outbreak. He said, what would happen if we had a situation with an infection which was as deadly as Ebola, but as infectious as flu? And lo and behold, and he warned about that every year. He started international germ games like international war games to try and warn against it. He went and saw Trump when Trump took over, and Trump took no notice of him. He's put about 500 million into building capacity in vaccine distribution, and he's committed billions to setting up 7 factories to produce parallel copies of the various vaccines that are in trial, even before we know whether they're going to work or not. And he says, well, if 5 of them don't work but 2 do, well, that's a good investment of money. So you see the kind of the advantage of philanthropy, and philanthropy has grown hugely in the past 2 decades. There are about 250,000 philanthropy foundations through the world now, and 3/4 of them have come about in the last 20 years, and they control about $1.5 trillion. So this is big stuff. And I wanted to explore and examine that, and also look at what its downsides were.
Right. So if we're talking about seriously rich people giving billions sometimes to the causes that they choose, there are a lot more philanthropists than there were around 30 or 40 years. And so you explore the downsides and the upsides. Is it possible to say where you come down on whether it's a downside or an upside overall?
It's not that kind of book. It would probably sell more if it was an anti-philanthropy book or a pro-philanthropy book. But it actually it points out what the good sides of philanthropy are and what the downsides are, and then suggests ways in which to counteract the bad points and accentuate the good ones. And I mean, we'll come on to that as we explore.
So you start by tracing the development of philanthropy through 2 main traditions. One is Greek and the other is Jewish and then Christian. Can you take us back to those roots and explain how those 2 strands are very different?
Well, philanthropy is a Greek word, as everybody knows. It means philos, love, and anthropos, mankind. It's a lover of mankind. It's first used as a term of abuse against Prometheus in Aeschylus's play. But at the height of Athenian democracy in the 4th century, there was a system where rich people were expected to fund some specific cause, like sending a team of athletes to the Olympic Games, or putting on a play, or something huge like building a temple or a warship. And it was really about the place of the rich in society, and what we would now call social cohesion or social control. And it was about the rich, essentially. It wasn't about the poor, and it was top down. Now, in the same era, across the other side of the Middle East, the Jews were developing an entirely different approach to philanthropy, and that was a religious one. God had been generous in his creation, and so it was incumbent on men and women to be generous to one another, and to give is to imitate God. And so, unlike the Greeks, where it was about the rich, everybody had a duty to give. And so, rather than being top down, it was much more two-way. And interestingly, the Hebrew word for charity, tzedakah, is the same as the Hebrew word for justice. So that gives you a clue. And these two traditions can be traced through the next 2,000 years of philanthropy up to the present day. And that's what the book does.
I mean, I might make a distinction and say one was about philanthropy, the Greeks, which was about very rich people, and the other is about charity, which is about everybody having a right, a duty to give money. I mean, is that...
Well, the Pope recently contrasted what he called simple philanthropy with Christian charity, and I deconstructed that in an article in the tablet, because the Pope obviously doesn't know what philanthropy is, because philanthropy is certainly not simple. It's been many different things over the course of those 2,000 years. Sometimes it's more than one thing at once, but it's much more complicated than that.
Okay, but what makes my gift of not very much an act of charity rather than an act of philanthropy? Isn't it about the amount, largely about the amount of money I have to give?
Well, in the modern world, philanthropy means a rich person giving a large amount of money, but there are lots of other ways of doing it, and we might look at the first person in this country to be called a philanthropist was John Howard, the prison reformer. We know him now from the Howard League of Prison Reform. He didn't give money. He gave huge amounts of time. He dedicated his whole life to prison visiting in this country and all around Europe. And William Wilberforce, around the same time, those are the kind of people who were first called philanthropists in England. So you can just get a little hint from that the idea of it being about rich people giving money is something that's very particular and very modern.
Well, you come to a few key historical moments in the development of the history of philanthropy, and the first, before the year you've just been talking about, was the Black Death. And you say that the Black Death did the most to change irrevocably the attitude of the rich towards the poor. You say it was sending philanthropy in an entirely new direction. What was it that happened at the Black Death which made that change in direction?
Well, when Christianity arrived on the scene, it tried to merge the two traditions, the Jewish and the Greek. And at first, these things were held in balance. But through 1,000 years of Christendom, from the 4th century to the 14th, the Jewish, this communitarian mutual tradition began to hold sway, and the rich had an obligation to assist the poor materially, and the poor had an obligation to pray for the rich. So it was much more of a two-way process. Well, what happened when the Black Death came was that, I mean, interestingly, previous histories of philanthropy have said that the big change came at the Reformation, and it was about making philanthropy more scientific and more modern. But what my book shows is that this is wrong, and that is just Protestant spin after the Reformation, trying to do down this 1,000 years of charity making act was haphazard and self-serving. But what actually happened was 100 years before the Reformation, the Black Death changed the whole demography and the whole social and economic structure of European society. There was an agricultural revolution, a growth in trade, a growth in towns. The economy was monetized. It was really the first stirrings of capitalism, and philanthropy changed then too, because as the whole balance of feudal society and the way that land was held and farmed and changed. The value of labor of some poor people went up, but there was a huge amount of vagrant people who were just like a tide of beggars who swept through Europe, and people became very alarmed at them. They saw that this was a possible source of insurrection, and a much more hostile attitude developed to the poor then, and it reverted to that Greek tradition of philanthropy as social control. And you see that in the Elizabethan Poor Law. This idea arose that the poor were in some way to blame for their own poverty, and we can see traces of that in lots of social attitudes today. And it was there in the Elizabethan Poor Laws. It was there in the Victorian Poor Law, the Victorian charity, the moralizing attitude of a lot of the Victorian charities. It reached its apotheosis with Andrew Carnegie, who, the Scottish immigrant in the States, became the richest man in the world and in about 1901. And he turned himself then to full-time philanthropy. And he was an adherent of social Darwinism. The philosopher Herbert Spencer, who tried to apply Darwin's survival of the fittest to human society. In fact, it was Spencer who invented the phrase survival of the fittest, not Darwin. And Spencer had this notion that the rich were somehow innately superior to the poor. And of course, very, very mega rich people, particularly in the States, where there was no regulations, no taxes, and people became hugely wealthy, rather like they are in the present era. They adopted this philosophy, this idea that the rich should decide everything. It should be top down, and if you just gave money to the poor, they'd only spend it on drink and all that kind of thing. So this template was then set by Andrew Carnegie, which is basically the template with which many huge givers in philanthropy today operate still.
So talk us through that template. I think you call it effective altruism. What are the sort of pitfalls of that? How does it operate?
Well, effective altruism is a philosophy that has been invented by Peter Singer. Many people know him better as the animal rights person, but effective altruism basically says that human choices should be made by using data to measure efficiency. So giving should be rational and not emotional or sentimental. So he says that every life has equal value, and that's the formula that Bill Gates has got at the top of his foundation website. So the goal of philanthropy under effective altruism should be to save us as many lives as possible. So it's much better to spend your money in a developing country than it is here, because you get more bang for your buck, kind of thing. It's got a downside, because it says that if you go into your local pub and there's a collecting thing on the bar which says, we're trying to raise £10,000 for the boy around the corner to go to have a life-saving treatment in America because he's got leukemia. Singer says you shouldn't give to that. You should give the money to some aid agency that can use the £10,000 to correct the cataracts of 10,000 people in India. And you can see the attraction of that, but it's got a huge downside, because it creates a kind of attitude to philanthropy, which is, it works okay with simple things, $3 will buy you one bed net. You can see that. But what about supporting a human rights organization which is campaigning against a transnational mining company that's killing trade unionists, polluting the environment and dodging taxes? Much more difficult to make the equation on what's best there. And the effective altruist philosophy appeals very much to the kind of business orientated super rich today, or not super rich, mega rich, who look that our enterprise acumen and skills have created this huge fortune. We must be the best people to decide how to spend it. And what the book then goes on to suggest is that they're not.
But there are sort of some a pro and con of that, is that they are mega rich, and they can be experimental and yes, make mistakes, but also have some huge successes as well.
Yeah, well, that's part of the equation that the book explores. What are the good points and what are the downsides of philanthropy? Bill Gates, you can't gainsay the fact that Bill Gates has vaccinated 2.5 billion children against polio, and that polio has been virtually eradicated in the world now. I mean, that is just, an unmitigated good. But Bill Gates has made a lot of mistakes on the way. He's spent £2 billion on a project to work with a million underprivileged minority pupils in American schools. And after it had been going a few years, he just suddenly decided this wasn't a good idea, and he axed it and switched tack entirely, leaving all these students with a disruptive education. So there you see, a project which is a philanthropist learning along the way, oh, that doesn't work, it's a failed project, just $2 billion, let's face it, you can move on quite easily. But to the kids involved, it's lost years of education. And so that kind of balance doesn't really work with an effective altruist philosophy. And there are lots of other downsides to that the book goes into.
Take us down the other stream, the sort of Judeo-Christian stream, which crudely might be taken to lead to what you call reciprocal philanthropy. Explain how that operates.
Well, that's got, I mean, although I've said that the top-down social control model has been dominant since the Black Death, this tradition that you're talking about, the other tradition, has kind of surfaced through the years. So you can see it in the response of the Enlightenment philanthropists who I've talked about, Howard and Wilberforce and so forth. But you can also see it in the 5% philanthropy of Octavia Hill, who treated her tenants as she was a landlord as well as the founder of the National Trust, and she treated her tenants with huge personal respect. You could see it in the new Lanark factories of Robert Owen, who this again, the Enlightenment, Rousseau's idea that on teachings on nature and nurture, and the conviction if you create the right environment for the people who live and work there, they'll become good, rational, decent individuals. You can see it in the Quaker philanthropy of George Cadbury and Joseph Rowntree, the chocolate makers. They are interesting because they changed their business methods to fit in with their philanthropy, whereas today the big givers are expecting philanthropy to change to fit in with business methods. And what is now the minority tradition survives with a number of philanthropists who put the emphasis on both listening to the people that they're helping and having a much more two-way relationship, more of a partnership, more mutual respect. And listening is a huge thing. A lot of big philanthropists don't listen; they just do what they think is a good idea. And a lot of the philanthropists today in the Hebrew tradition are supporting civil society groups to find their own voice and their own agency. And so that thread is still there and still vibrant. It's not been suppressed entirely. But what I'm suggesting is in the book is that both sides have got something to learn from the other, and you could get something better if philanthropy was rebalanced.
I'm going to go to Andrew Brown now for 4 or 5 minutes. Andrew, are you there?
Yeah, the question that jumped out at me from the political part of your book was the relation of tax to philanthropy. Do you think it's reasonable that people should get tax relief on philanthropic donations?
Well, it's a thorny issue because there are pros and cons with it. Obviously, the downside of tax relief on philanthropy is that if you're a mega rich giver and you're paying 45% tax, and you give a £100 million donation to something, you get £45 million tax relief on it. So in effect, your £100 million donation is only costing you 65, and it's costing us, the taxpayers, 45. Now, one of the things that the book highlights is that the rich have different interests. I mean, you can see this through sociologically and through opinion polls and surveys, that the interests of the rich are different from the interests of the rest of us. And so if they are putting their money into, I don't know, an opera house, and most people would rather it went into support for community sports or something, you've got a situation where the interests of the rich are being subsidized by the poor in ways which they might not have voted for were they able to. So there's a kind of democratic deficit about philanthropy. And people have suggested various solutions to this. One is that you might say, oh, well, we'll allow you high tax relief if you're giving to a homeless shelter, but not if you're giving to an opera house or a donkey sanctuary or and the aura is the key point, because as Rowan Williams points out in the interview I do with him in the book, who decides? And in the end, one of the advantages of philanthropy is it provides an alternative source of values and power to the state, and so it's able to challenge state priorities sometimes. So if the state decides that this is more important than that, that's well and good. But as Rowan points out, it can lead to a dictatorial situation in which, we've seen so many instances in the modern world where the state has a malign influence as well as a benign one. And so you're then faced with the question, okay, let's reform tax relief, but then how do you do it? And the how, people have tried. Gladstone tried. George Osborne had a small go at it. Obama had a small go at it, but they all run up against the same problem: that what's a better alternative?
Gladstone, I thought from your book, simply tried to abolish it rather than to reform it.
He wanted to abolish tax relief. Other people have tried to reduce it slightly, but no politicians have succeeded because of the outcry from charities, the general public, the Daily Mail, and the philanthropists themselves.
Kind of basic to the question of philanthropy is, do you think on the whole the rich are morally better and more generous than the rest of us?
No, it's quite clear if you compare the statistics that people are generous across the board. And if you look at something like comic relief or crowdfunding, you see a kind of democratization of philanthropy, the kind of things that people raise money for in the workplace. They raise money for different things, but they raise money and they give money in good proportion to their income. And one of the things about philanthropists is that they draw a lot of fire from people criticizing them, but they're a tiny minority of the super rich, and
yes.
A lot of the rich don't give anything at all.
I was astonished by some of the statistics in your book. I mean, the medium level of giving among the ultra rich, I mean, the really, presumably people with really a very great deal of money, give away £240 a year.
Yeah, I mean, it is shocking. It's one of the, well, I mean, there are philanthropy pressure groups which see their job as being to try and increase giving amongst the super rich, and well, even the rich. I mean, anybody over, I think, about £10 million counts as rich in this category. But it's an uphill battle.
What would you do to stimulate it? And if you think on the whole philanthropy is a good thing, as you clearly do, and presumably we can all agree that spending your money that way is better than, blowing it on the other things that the super rich. Yes.
Yeah.
So how would you stimulate it?
Well, one of the ways to stimulate it is through tax relief. So that's one of the arguments against reforming tax relief. There are these initiatives like the people like the Beacon Collaborative run in this country. They're trying to raise the overall level of giving amongst the rich in this country. Bill Gates has got his giving pledge, where he is trying to persuade fellow billionaires to give at least half of their money away before they die or in their will. Lots of them have signed up to it. It's not clear how many of them are actually fulfilling it. So that's a bit of a. So, I mean, it's a thorny question, and the answer is there are lots of ways of trying to do it, but none of them have proved to be, enormously transparently successful to date.
I'd like to bring in Tim Wyatt now. Andrew, do come back
Okay.
again if you'd like to. But I'll go to Tim now, and Tim Wyatt.
Hi, thanks, Rosie. Thanks, Paul. It's a really fascinating topic. I wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the start about the two kind of roots, the Greek root and the kind of Judeo-Christian root of philanthropy. Can you think of any examples of kind of contemporary philanthropists today who are very deliberately trying to avoid that Greek model and are instead consciously trying to emulate the Judeo-Christian one? And if so, do they tend to be religious people themselves?
I don't think there's necessarily, I mean, there are kind of two questions there. Religious people do give a lot more than non-religious people, that is clear. But it's not clear that this kind of giving through a partnership, mutual respect listening model, which I'm advocating and calling reciprocal philanthropy, it's not clear that that is particularly driven by any kind of religious feeling. You could look at the Nova Foundation in the States, which is run by Warren Buffett's son, Peter, and Peter's wife, Jennifer. And that empowers Black women and campaigns against domestic violence. And they've had a very particular model of listening to their partners and gearing their philanthropy in a way in which responds to that. And they've had a really good record of that over 10 years. Sadly, they depend on Warren Buffett's money for their funding. And when the stock market collapsed at the beginning of the COVID crisis, they lost a lot of money. And so they've reverted to a bit more of a top-down attitude. And one of the things that the book says is that, you know, this is to be lamented. But there are a lot of others. The book, the first 2 years of my research on the book were financed by a British philanthropist, Sir Trevor Pears, and his family foundation is very keen on listening to what their partners want, and to core funding, which is a bit technical, but a lot of philanthropists want to fund this particular project because they can see the results and they can trumpet them. And what charities and grassroots organizations often want is not to be funded to do this, but to be funded for their general work. So a philanthropist who specializes in core funding, like the Pears Foundation, is adhering to that model. So yes, there are a lot of people doing that, and there's a lot of good practice, but there's a lot of bad practice too.
And clearly, you spend a lot of time explaining and exploring how current philanthropy is done badly. I wondered whether, because I know you're very interested as well in faith and Christianity as well, do you think the world would benefit from religious leaders taking this as a kind of a social injustice to tackle? You know, would you like to see the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Pope tell Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg that they're giving their money away badly and here's how to do it better? Or do you think religion doesn't have a moral high ground on this issue anymore?
Well, I think there are general statements which would support that kind of position in stuff that the Pope has written in his encyclicals in recent times. And one thing that's not very well known is that the Pope has supported a social investment program, and he hosted a conference on that about 4 years ago in the Vatican. And social investment is a way that says to investors who have got a kind of philanthropic bent, if you invest your money here, you will get a return on it, but it will only be 5% or whatever, because the whole investment is going to be structured so it brings social benefit rather than just profit to you. And the Pope is trying to encourage that, and the way that he's done that is to encourage a lot of a lot of Catholic charities, particularly in America, to invest billions in this kind of social investment. And social investment is an interesting phenomenon because it does marry the two sides of strategic and reciprocal philanthropy, because it's quite kind of precise and focused in its business methods, but it's also got a more kind of empathetic, compassionate and listening side to it. So that is one example of marrying these two traditions in a way which makes things better.
And just lastly then, I'm just really curious to know, if you became a billionaire overnight, what would you do with that money?
Can you believe I have not given any thought to that at all? Because it's such an unlikely event. You don't get to be a billionaire by writing books about philanthropy.
If Warren
you don't get to be a billionaire by writing books about anything except, you know, beach airport thrillers.
Okay, can I ask then, because this is not such mega bucks, but a Euro lottery winner this week got £79 million. So if that was me and I said, well, I'm going to give away all but 1 million of that, what advice would you give to me about the considerations to bear in mind in disposing of that money?
Well, I think one of the things that you find when you look at philanthropy generally is that philanthropists are motivated by something personal in their lives. You know, their mum died of cancer, so they fund cancer research. They went to this particular school which did well by them, so they give bursaries for poor people to go to that school or whatever. So the personal element, I think, is a starting place. That's where I would advise you to start, and to because that will keep you motivated. Because a lot of the importance about philanthropy is not just handing the money out and moving on. It's about being involved in it and adjusting your giving to give more in certain situations, and to see whether this is working and that's not working, but done in partnership with the people that you're trying to help. So that would be the first thing. Find something that you that is really important to you, and then you need to do some research, and you need to talk to organizations in that particular area, and go and visit them, look at their work, and listen to what they say. And that one of the key messages for modern philanthrocapitalists is stop talking and start listening.
Okay, thank you. Ruth Peacock, can I come to you, and then can we go to Andrew again?
Yeah, there was a report written just a couple of weeks ago by Danny Kruger. He's the son of Prue Leith, and he's a Conservative MP in Devizes in Wiltshire. And he was talking about the role or the relationship between the government and charities when it comes to welfare provision. And he said that we should acknowledge through COVID, we've seen faith groups right in the front line of providing essential help or food, particularly. And the government should acknowledge this and work with faith organisations to provide basic welfare provision. I'm just wondering what reflection you have on the relationship between the state and charities in delivering care that can save lives.
Well, I think that I'd start by saying Danny Kruger used to be Boris Johnson's personal secretary, so he's got an in there. But that means he's also committed to some of the more unpalatable aspects of this current government's policy. He's not just talking about faith communities, he's talking about communities in general. One of the things that we've seen in the pandemic is, you know, from everything the local neighborhood groups fetching medicine for people who can't get out and that kind of thing. Faith has been an important driver in that, but a lot of it has been community and neighborhood orientated. So it is important that philanthropists encourage that kind of development, because one of the things that I've got an interview with David Sainsbury in the book. He gave £1 billion. He's the first Briton to give away £1 billion of his own money. He's also, you know, been key for decades in the Sainsbury supermarket empire, and he was also a government minister for a few years. So he's got quite an interesting take on what is the relationship between business, philanthropy, and the government, and what do those different groups do better. What are their strengths? And one of the strengths, I think, of philanthropy is that it needs to support these groups in civil society, what Burke called the little platoons, who kind of mediate between the state and the individual, and who can amplify the voices of smaller people in these debates. So there's an example of something that you know, philanthropy can do that government can't do, and that the business sector is not interested in doing. Philanthropy, we were discussing earlier, can look at you know, really left field innovations in a way which business wouldn't put money into, because the prospects of a return are slight, and which governments wouldn't be interested in, because they go far beyond the next electoral cycle. So it's useful to see philanthropy as a kind of an alternative pillar in society. It's part of that voluntary sector. I'm not sure where that takes us with regard to the faith aspect of it. I think it's broader than that.
Andrew, do you want to come in again on this? Andrew Brown, did you want to come in again?
Yes, no, it's all right. I was just trying to find my mute button. you do write in parts in the book about the danger to charities and to philanthropy of being used simply as it were, the tips of the tentacles of government. They become delivery agencies, they lose their independence. It's essentially a sort of part privatization of the welfare state. Just how dangerous do you think that that exercise is?
I think that has been the case, and right from Margaret Thatcher onwards, every prime minister has used the charitable sector to as fingers on the hand of the state. And some charities have a huge percentage, like 80% of their income comes from government, and that obviously constrains their ability to criticize government policy, where that might be thought to be impairing the best interests of their clients. So there's definitely a concern about that, and it's important that there is a kind of a diversity in the ecology of charities, because the more that is the case, the less so that they can be constrained by that kind of government influence. But it is a major worry, and it's an irony that Thatcher, who was kind of all about freedom and independence in one area, was so controlling and centralizing in another, and that all the prime ministers since have followed in her lead.
Right, that's a particularly British question. I also have a gigantic global question to which I have no idea of the answer. And it's also connected with the diversity of charities. If you look at the Koch brothers, who are in one definition philanthropists, their work, their propaganda, if we take seriously the business of climate change, has probably contributed to the deaths of very large numbers of people. If climate catastrophe is what we're expecting it to be. And if you were trying to draw up a balance of philanthropic activity, how much of the rest of it would theirs outweigh? Can you actually, at what stage does philanthropy, or what technically counts as philanthropy in tax terms and so on, tip over into something actively damaging?
Well, the Koch brothers, one of whom has died recently, they, for people who don't know, they fund a lot of free market think tanks in the States, and their business depends upon oil and chemical manufacture and distribution, and they're known as one of the biggest polluters in America, and they finance a lot of academics, right-wing academics, to say that deregulation is a good thing and that people shouldn't have to pay for pollution in this in the way that is widely advocated. They've also funded a lot of academics who are climate change deniers, and that's what Andrew's referring to here. Part of the philosophical problem of dealing with people like them is that if you look at what they do and the way that they take advantages of the tax law and the activities they get up to, and you set them alongside somebody, say, like Mike Bloomberg, who the unsuccessful presidential candidate this time round, who was mayor of New York 3 times, and he spent huge amounts of money trying to remove the coal-fired plants from the United States, and in anti-smoking laws and in other laws which are kind of totally incompatible with the Koch brothers philosophy. It's very hard to see how you can have in a free society constraints on the Koch brothers that wouldn't apply also to Bloomberg, and there are just as many climate change philanthropists, although they don't give perhaps as much money as the Kochs have individually. Collectively, there would be a kind of sense of balance about it. But I've deliberately not tried to balance out good and bad philanthropy, as you might call it, in a kind of equation, because I just see that there would be this huge philosophical problem about trying to constrain people, when one of the advantages of philanthropy is that it constitutes an alternative kind of voice in society and to constrain that or to silence it, I think would have more downsides than up.
Could I go to Sorcha now? Sorcha Connell.
Hi, Paul. I have a question about decolonializing wealth, because that is something that I don't feel is discussed maybe enough in this country, is the source of some of our wealth and how sometimes it's accumulated on the backs of others, and then it's chosen, then somebody who's a lot richer is able to choose some smaller parts to be able to give away. I understand this is something that's happened throughout history, but I'm more curious about your thoughts if there is a reckoning that needs to happen at some point about this subject.
Well, one of the great critics of Andrew Carnegie was a man called Tucker, and he said that no amount of charity can compensate for lack of justice, and that is an important baseline to hold on to. Having said that, is a philanthropist? I mean, I thought this. Here's something controversial. I thought this during the attacks on the slave trader Colston in Bristol, when the attention was being directed to his past because he happens to have a statue, and he's got a statue because he was a philanthropist. There were a lot of slave traders whose behavior was as shameful and egregious as Colston, and nobody ever brings them into any reckoning. And the irony is that it's his acts of philanthropy which have put him in the public spotlight. We see a modern equivalent of that with the Sackler family, who their drug company has just gone bust in the States as a result of the opioid crisis. 200,000 people have died of opioid addiction there, and the campaigners targeted the Sacklers through their philanthropy. So if you go to the Louvre now, the Sackler wing is now just called the wing. They actually stuck grade tape over the word Sackler, and that's happened like a series of dominoes all across the art world. So you can see that philanthropy is in one. There's an ambiguity here, because philanthropy is at least these people doing something good, and yet that puts them in the spotlight in a way which they wouldn't otherwise be. So I'm not justifying their position, but I'm just saying that we need to have a bit wider sense of moral outrage about the past. In the States in particular, people are trying to redress this by working on how to fund justice, racial justice charities and grassroots organizations. And that's a huge discussion in philanthropy. And one of the biggest grassroots organizations in Chicago, the CEO of that is going to be speaking at the British Library next month at the official launch of my book. And she will have some interesting things to say on that. And I'll have some interesting questions to ask her about how you go about this, because it does seem to be more difficult to find philanthropists who are prepared to hand over money to organizations like that. And it's about this basic conundrum, is that philanthropists are happy to hand over their money, but they're not happy to hand over their power. And what I've tried to do in the book is to find ways in which they can be persuaded to be more accommodating in that sense. It's not a revolutionary answer, it's an incremental one.
Michael Wakelin has his hand up.
Hi, Paul. Thanks very much. Fascinating. I just wondered whether your research took you into the realm of all these fabulously, suddenly rich young men in the world of football. I mean, Marcus Rashford is doing a fantastic job, obviously not with his money necessarily, but with his influence. But we do hear about people like Mo Salah, who's created hospitals and schools in Egypt, and other people that in the past I can think of. Kanu, who used to play for Arsenal, was reputedly, saving several villages in his native land. And I just wonder whether there's any sign that these fabulously, very quickly rich young people, some of whom earn more in a month than a staff nurse will do in the entire of her professional career, whether there's any sign that they show a gracious philanthropic spirit.
Well, I think the examples you've just given us show that there are people in that group who are doing something very much along the same lines. I mean, what Marcus Rashford is doing is in that tradition that goes back to John Howard as the activist philanthropist. He's not just giving money away. He's putting pressure on the government and creating a stir. There will, I mean, it goes back to what I was saying to Andrew Brown. There are super rich footballers who don't do it, and super rich footballers who do. And the sad thing is that that the activist ones are in the minority. And so one of the tasks is to try to encourage the rest of to follow the example of people like Rashford.
Ruth, you have another question?
Yeah, just looking for a top line out of this, Paul. Really to try to get the kind of essence and nub of what you're trying to get to in the book. How would you sum up where we are now in 2020 in the time of the pandemic when it comes to philanthropy? Would you say that people, rich philanthropists and others who give, are more generous, less generous, more visible, less visible than in previous generations?
I think if you look at individuals like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, they have got huge amounts of money. And they have got those amounts of money through the kind of process of globalization, which has also produced increasing levels of inequality. And so what we've got now at the start of the 21st century is pretty much what they had in America at the start of the 20th century with people like Carnegie and Rockefeller and so forth. So the answer is that there is greater riches, there is greater inequality, and those philanthropists who are active need to be encouraged to be thinking more about how to empower people to make their voices heard in the struggle against this inequality, rather than just addressing some of the symptoms of the current problem.
What's the best thing a philanthropist can do? I mean, is it to create a foundation which campaigns against people getting so much money in the first place? I'm telling you all to give it away. I mean, it's just, you say, you know, there are more philanthropists than ever and there's greater inequality than ever. And those two are not disconnected, are they? I mean, do we just need to make them feel an awful lot more uncomfortable? Or not, because a few of them are nice?
Well, there are two schools of thought on that. I keep coming back to being even-handed, I'm afraid. Yes, you can embarrass philanthropists by what they do, and that can have, you know, a downside as well, because it puts other rich people off giving. They think, well, what's the point? You just get it in the neck. Beth Breeze, who's an academic in Kent, is very exercised about this. I quote her in the book. She says that the modern media culture is very antipathetic to philanthropy and too cynical, and everybody assumes that if a philanthropy gives something, it has to be a tax dodge. Well, it can be a tax benefit, but it's very rarely a tax dodge, because you've got to give the money in the first place, and even if you're giving less than people think you're giving, you are still giving, unlike those members of the super rich who are not giving. So I'm not sure how much we want to kind of excoriate philanthropists, but we do want to encourage them to be more introspective, so that they can look at what they do and say, well, maybe that's better than this. So that's the sad middle of the road conclusion that I come to. Won't give you a headline, Ruth, I'm afraid, but I think that the rich who don't give need to be asked why they're not giving. And the rich who do give need to be asked if they're doing it in the best possible way.
And is there anything sort of happening culturally with the pandemic, do you think? Anything in the water that is shifting attitudes, which might lead to a shift in the direction of philanthropy?
Well, we can already see some philanthropists being less directive than they were, and demanding, in response to the emergency nature of the pandemic, demanding of charities that they produce reports and are accountable and do evaluations and stuff. Now, obviously, you can go too far with that. You can't just dish money out regardless without seeing, you know, what the what the consequences of that are, to what extent that money has been put to good use. But there is a sense in which the philanthrocapitalist model was doing too much of that kind of analysis and evaluation, and not enough of the support. And that has changed slightly in the pandemic. Some of those constraints are being lifted as a result of it. So there are some shifts. The big question, though, is will philanthropy carry on with this practice of kind of cementing the place of the super rich at the top of society, and being a kind of reputation launderer, or will it actually change anything for the better? And as with so much with this pandemic, it's too early to say. It could just reinforce the existing structures of inequality, but it could actually open up to some of these things that Danny Kruger was talking about. And if you just look around your local community, you can see a different spirit of activism and cooperation on the ground. Philanthropy could encourage that. Let's hope it does.
Yeah. I just wonder if we need another word between philanthropy and charity. I mean, to middle income earners who read your book and might be tempted to think, well, that's all about the philanthropists, and it's not a message for me. I mean, what's the message for those people of your book?
If you look at the democratization of philanthropy, which I talk about through crowdfunding and crowdsourcing and workplace giving, and the kinds of giving to charities and the telethons, there's definitely a role for people, ordinary people, to give through that, and they do already. It's just that it's not generally visible, except at the time of children in need or comic relief. But that kind of thing is going on all the time, and the idea that you shouldn't. You don't have to give because you're not super rich. I don't see that needs any justification, because people do that already. I mean, the British public are generous in their giving.
But if the word relationship is key, isn't it, in philanthropy, in charitable giving? That's one of the things that you're saying about reciprocal philanthropy. There's something about there's an exchange there that is central to good giving.
Yeah, well, the present Pope said something about don't toss coins at beggars. You put the money in their hand, look them in the eyes, and talk to them. And it's amazing, if you do that, what kind of difference it makes to them and to you. And there is something about there's a kind of mutual respect. It's about seeing the other as a person like you, and not as a problem to be solved.
Right, there we will leave it. Thank you very much, Paul, for taking this hour to be with us, and to all of you who have joined us and asked questions. And we'll be back on Tuesday with a new Zoom, and then next Thursday we're reflecting on what we might and might not know about the outcome of the American election. Look forward to seeing you. Bye.